blood had a scent in the ash forests. Iron and earth, mingled with the bitter tang of fear. Isara Darkfin knew that scent well. She had worn it on her skin more times than she could count, had tasted it on the wind before battle found her. Tonight, it came with voices. Low, predatory, circling something small and precious. The moon hung like a silver wound in the sky, bleeding pale light through the skeletal branches above. Isara moved through the shadows with the silence of falling snow, her red dress a whisper of crimson against the gray-black landscape. Her white hair caught fragments of moonlight, making her appear almost spectral, a ghost born of winter and warfare. Then she saw them. 5 warriors, their armor dull and mismatched, their weapons drawn. Renegades. She recognized the torn insignias, the defiant way they wore their exile like a badge of honor. Between them, backed against an ancient oak whose roots twisted into the earth like gnarled fingers, stood a wolf cub. White as fresh snow, small as hope, trembling but not cowering. The cub's eyes found hers across the clearing. Gold, burning gold, like embers refusing to die. One of the warriors lunged, the cub yelped, and Isara moved. She was a storm given human form. Her first strike came before they registered her presence, her blade singing through the air and finding the gap between helmet and gorget. The first warrior fell, gurgling, his surprise frozen on his face even as life left his eyes. The others turned, weapons rising, but Isara was already spinning, her red dress flaring like blood on water. She fought the way winter fought spring, inevitable and merciless. Her second opponent swung a heavy axe, the kind meant to cleave through bone and armor alike. She ducked beneath it, felt the wind of its passage kiss her hair, and drove her dagger up through his ribs. He fell forward, his weight carrying him past her into the dirt. 3 remained. They circled her now, wary, their confidence cracking like ice under pressure. One barked orders, trying to coordinate their attack. Isara didn't give them time. She feinted left, drew 2 of them in that direction, then pivoted and drove her shoulder into the third, using his own momentum against him. Her blade found his throat before he hit the ground. The remaining 2 attacked together, one high and one low, a practiced maneuver. But Isara had fought in wars these renegades could only imagine. She leaped, her body twisting in midair, and both blades passed beneath her. She landed between them, drove her elbow into one's temple hard enough to snap his neck, and spun to face the last warrior. He stood frozen, his sword trembling in his grip, watching his companions bleed into the earth. Isara met his eyes, and whatever he saw there made him drop his weapon and run. She let him go. Some men needed to carry stories back into the dark places they came from, stories of women who did not hesitate, who did not bow. Silence settled over the clearing like falling ash. Isara turned to the wolf cub, breathing hard, her blade still dripping crimson onto the forest floor. The cub hadn't moved. He watched her with those burning golden eyes, no fear in them now, only a strange recognition that made something in Isara's chest tighten unexpectedly. She approached slowly, sheathing her weapons, and knelt before him. The cub stepped forward, small paws pressing into the blood-soaked earth, and pressed his nose against her palm. The touch sent warmth flooding through her, a sensation she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Connection. Without thinking, without questioning, Isara gathered the cub into her arms. He was warm and solid, his heart beating rapidly against her chest. He nuzzled into her neck, and she felt something break open inside her. Some locked chamber she'd sealed shut years ago when she'd chosen the lonely path of a wandering warrior. The cub made a soft sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a purr. It spoke of relief, of safety found after terror, of a trust given freely to someone who'd proven themselves worthy. Isara held him closer, her fingers tangling in his soft white fur, and for the first time in years, She didn't feel alone. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd come from, or why renegade warriors had been hunting him with such determination. But she knew this. She would keep him safe, whatever it cost, whatever it demanded of her. Before we begin the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. In the pinned comment, you'll find a special selection of the best Amazon books that inspire our stories. If you purchase any book through those links, you'll be directly supporting the channel and helping us create more stories. Tell us where you're watching from and how old you are in the comments. I hope you enjoy the story. The moon watched them in silence as Isara carried the cub from the clearing, leaving the bodies behind for the forest to reclaim. Behind her, blood sank into hungry earth. Before her, an unknown path unfurled like a ribbon in the dark. And in her arms, a wolf cub who didn't know he was a prince slept peacefully for the first time since he'd been stolen from his father's side. The ash forests gave way to rolling hills covered in silver grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Isara walked for hours, the cub secure in her arms, occasionally waking to lick her chin before drifting back to sleep. She found shelter in a cave carved into a hillside, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of hanging willow branches that swayed like dancers in the breeze. Inside, she built a small fire, coaxing flames from dry wood and tinder she kept wrapped in oilcloth in her pack. The light painted dancing shadows on stone walls, and the warmth pushed back the night's chill. The cub woke fully then, blinking sleep from his golden eyes, and Isara watched as he explored their temporary sanctuary with cautious curiosity. He was beautiful. His fur held an almost ethereal quality, pure white without a single mark or blemish, as though he'd been carved from moonlight itself. When he moved, there was an inherent grace to him, a dignity that seemed far too mature for his small frame. He wasn't just any wolf cub. She'd known that from the moment she'd seen him. There was something royal in the set of his shoulders, something ancient in those knowing eyes. After his exploration, the cub returned to her, settling himself against her side with a contented sigh. Isara ran her fingers through his fur, marveling at its softness, and felt an unfamiliar emotion blooming in her chest. Tenderness. She who had lived by the sword, who had made herself hard as stone to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the soft, found herself melting under the simple trust of a creature who should have feared her blood-stained hands. Days became weeks. Isara tried to find the cub's pack, his family, anyone who might be searching for him. She traveled to border territories, asked questions in villages and trading posts, described the unusual white cub to anyone who would listen. But no one claimed him. No one recognized him. It was as though he'd appeared from nowhere, a ghost given form, meant for her alone. The cub, whom she'd begun calling Veyron after the old word for protector, seemed to have no desire to leave her side. He followed her everywhere, his small legs working tirelessly to keep pace. When she trained with her weapons, he watched with focused intensity, as though studying her movements, learning from her. When she hunted for food, he stayed close but quiet, instinctively understanding the need for stealth. At night, when the world grew cold and dark, Veyron would curl against her, his warm body a comfort she hadn't known she needed. Sometimes she would wake to find him watching the cave entrance, alert, protective, as though he were guarding her rather than the other way around. It made her smile, this fierce devotion from something so small. One evening, as rain drummed against the earth outside their shelter, and lightning painted the sky in shades of purple and white, Isara sat by the fire and spoke to Veyron as though he could understand every word. "Your people must be looking for you. Somewhere. Someone must be missing you terribly." Veyron lifted his head from where it rested on his paws and met her gaze. There was something so human in that look, so full of intelligence and emotion, that it stole her breath. "But you don't want to go back, do you? You've chosen me, for reasons I don't understand." You've chosen this life, this strange companionship with a woman who has nothing to offer you but protection and whatever scraps of affection she's capable of giving." Veyron stood, crossed the space between them, and placed his head in her lap. His eyes closed, and a rumbling sound emerged from his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, a sound of contentment, of home found. Isara felt tears sting her eyes, the first she'd shed in years. She who had walked alone through battlefields, who had buried friends and lovers, who had hardened her heart against the world's cruelty, found herself undone by the simple trust of a wolf cub who had chosen her as his own. "All right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All right, little one. I'll keep you. We'll make our own pack, just the two of us. I don't know what the future holds, but I swear to you, I'll protect you with everything I am." Veyron's tail wagged just once, and Isara laughed through her tears. It was a broken sound, rusty with disuse, but it was real. More real than anything she'd felt in years. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. Veyron grew stronger, larger, his legs lengthening and his chest broadening, but he remained devoted to Isara with an intensity that bordered on reverence. When strangers approached, he would place himself between them and her, a growl rumbling in his throat despite his youth. When she was injured during a skirmish with bandits, he'd stayed pressed against her side for 3 days, while fever burned through her, as though his presence alone could keep death at bay. And perhaps it had. Perhaps the will to live, to not leave him alone in a harsh world, had been what pulled her back from the edge. They traveled together through territories both familiar and strange, through forests where trees grew so tall their tops disappeared into clouds, across rivers so clear you could count the stones on the bottom, over mountains where the air grew thin and the cold bit with teeth made of ice. And through it all, they were inseparable. Isara found herself changing. The hardness she'd cultivated, the emotional armor she'd built around herself, began to crack. Veyron's presence was a constant reminder that connection didn't have to mean weakness, that loving something didn't make you vulnerable, it made you stronger. She began to smile more, to find joy in small things like the way morning light caught in dewdrops or the sound of Veyron's playful bark when he chased rabbits through meadows. But always, in the back of her mind, lived the question: who was he? Where had he come from? And why had those warriors been so determined to kill him? The answer came on a night when the moon was full and the world seemed painted in shades of silver and shadow. They had camped in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, sheltered from the wind but exposed to the sky. Isara sat by the fire, sharpening her blade, while Veyron slept nearby, his sides rising and falling with deep, peaceful breaths. Then the howl came, long, mournful, full of loss and longing. It echoed through the valley, bouncing off stone walls and reverberating in Isara's chest like a second heartbeat. Veyron woke instantly, his head snapping up, his ears forward. Another howl answered the first, then another, until the night was full of wolves calling to the moon, calling to each other, calling to something lost. Veyron stood, trembling, and added his voice to the chorus. His howl was young, not yet carrying the full power it would one day possess, but it was filled with such longing, such recognition, that Isara felt her heart clench. Before she could stop him, Veyron bolted from the camp, racing into the darkness with speed she couldn't match. Isara grabbed her weapons and followed, fear and dread warring in her chest. She crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs, following the sound of Veyron's howls, following the thunder of paws against earth. She burst into a clearing and stopped dead. The sight before her stole the breath from her lungs and the strength from her legs. Wolves, dozens of them, their eyes glowing in the moonlight, their bodies massive and powerful. They formed a semicircle around the clearing's edge, watchful, protective. And in the center, surrounded by his pack, stood a man. No, Not just a man, an alpha. He was tall, taller than any warrior Isara had ever faced, his body corded with muscle that spoke of both violence and discipline. Long black hair fell past his shoulders, wild and untamed, and a beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. They burned with a fierce intelligence, a predatory focus, and a grief so deep it seemed bottomless. Those eyes found Veyron, and the change that came over the man was instantaneous. The warrior's mask shattered, revealing raw, desperate hope. He fell to his knees, his hands outstretched, and spoke a single word that carried the weight of months of searching, of sleepless nights and endless fear. Veyron. The cub, her Veyron, raced across the clearing and launched himself into the man's arms. The man caught him, crushed him against his chest, and buried his face in white fur. His shoulders shook. And Isara realized, with dawning horror and understanding, that this massive, powerful alpha was weeping. The wolves around the clearing began to howl, a sound of celebration and relief, of a lost member returned, of a kingdom's hope restored. And Isara stood at the edge of it all, watching, understanding flooding through her like ice water. The warriors who'd tried to kill Veyron hadn't been random renegades, they'd been assassins. And Veyron wasn't just a wolf cub she'd saved. He was an heir. A prince. The son of the man who now held him as though he'd never let go. Slowly, as though moving through deep water, the Alpha King raised his head and looked at her. His eyes, still wet with tears, found hers across the clearing. And in that moment, everything changed. Lorik Sunhollow had spent 3 months searching for his son. 3 months of sleepless nights and fruitless hunts, of following cold trails and chasing ghosts. 3 months of living with the crushing fear that his only child, his last connection to his beloved mate who died bringing their son into the world, was gone forever. His pack had been attacked by coordinated forces, enemies who'd used the chaos of battle to steal what was most precious to him. They'd separated Veyron from his side during the fighting, had pushed the young cub beyond the protected boundaries, into territories where a lone wolf, even a prince, could not survive. Lorik had torn through those who'd orchestrated the attack, had painted the earth red with their blood, but it hadn't brought his son back. He'd sent search parties in every direction, had offered rewards that could buy kingdoms, had personally traveled from territory to territory, asking questions, following any lead no matter how slim. And every night, when he returned to his den alone, the absence of his son's small form curled against his side was a wound that wouldn't heal. Until tonight. Until the howls had risen in the valley, and he'd heard a voice he'd thought silenced forever. Veyron. His son. Alive. And now Lorik knelt in the clearing, holding the precious weight of his child, feeling the rapid beat of a heart he'd feared had stopped forever, and he wept with a relief so profound it threatened to unmake him. But even through his tears, even through the overwhelming joy of reunion, his alpha senses were active, assessing, protecting, the woman who stood at the clearing's edge. He'd scented her before he'd seen her, had smelled blood and steel and something else, something wild and untamed that called to the wolf in him. When he looked at her, he saw moonlight made flesh, a warrior born of winter's heart, dangerous and beautiful in equal measure. More importantly, he saw the way Veyron kept glancing back at her, the way his son's body remained oriented toward her even while pressed against his own chest. The bond was obvious, undeniable. This woman, this strange creature with white hair and a red dress that whispered of blood and passion, had become something to his son, something important. Lorik gently set Veyron down and rose to his full height. His pack tensed, reading his body language, ready to attack or defend based on his command. But Lorik held up a hand, stilling them, and began to walk toward the woman. She didn't run, didn't reach for her weapons, though he could see them at her sides, could see the blood still staining her dress from recent combat. She simply stood there, watching him approach with eyes the color of storm clouds, waiting. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the slight tremor in her hands, the pulse beating rapidly at her throat, the way her breath came just a bit too fast. She was afraid, but she didn't show it beyond these small, unconscious signs. She met his gaze steadily, her chin lifted, defiant even in the face of an alpha who could kill her with his bare hands. "You saved my son." His voice emerged rough, raw from emotion and disuse. He watched her carefully, saw the way she swallowed before responding, the way she chose her words with deliberate care. "I didn't know he was anyone's son. He was being hunted by renegade warriors. I stopped them." "How many?" "5. Lorik blinked, studied her with new intensity. 5 trained warriors, and she stood before him without mortal injury, wearing their blood like a badge of honor. Either she was lying, or she was far more dangerous than her slender frame suggested. "You killed 5 warriors to save a wolf cub you didn't know?" She met his gaze without flinching. They were going to kill him. I don't let things like that happen when I can stop them. Something shifted in Lorik's chest. Respect, certainly. Admiration, perhaps, but also something else, something more primal and possessive. This woman had risked her life for his son, had shed blood to keep Veyron safe, had, by all accounts, succeeded where his entire pack had failed. "What is your name?" "Isara Darkfin." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, with quiet pride and no expectation of recognition, told him everything he needed to know. She was a wanderer, a lone warrior, someone who existed outside the structures of pack and kingdom, someone who answered to no one. Behind him, Veyron whined softly. Lorik turned and saw his son looking between them, his golden eyes full of distress. The cub understood, in the instinctive way of the very young, that something important was happening, that the 2 people he'd bonded with were meeting for the first time, that the future hung in the balance. Lorik looked back at Isara, saw the way her expression softened when she looked at Veyron, the way her hand lifted slightly, unconsciously, as though to reach for him. The bond between them was real. More than real. It was soul deep. "He has been with you since the attack." 3 months. Isara nodded. "I tried to find his pack, his family, but no one knew him. No one claimed him. Because I was searching in the wrong territories. Because those who stole him took him far from home." "I'm sorry," she said, and he heard genuine regret in her voice. "If I had known, I would have brought him to you sooner. Don't apologize. You kept him alive. You kept him safe when I couldn't. You gave him something I feared he'd lost forever." "What?" Lorik looked at his son, saw the way Veyron watched Isara with adoration, the way the cub's tail wagged whenever she shifted. He looked back at the woman who'd become his son's chosen guardian, his protector, his family. "Love," Lorik said quietly. "You gave him love when he had lost everything. For that, I owe you a debt I can never repay." Isara's eyes widened, surprise flickering across her features before she schooled them back to neutrality. But Lorik had seen it, that moment of vulnerability, and it told him more than words ever could. She wasn't as hard as she pretended, wasn't as untouchable as she appeared. Behind the warrior's mask lived a woman who felt deeply, who'd been wounded by the world, and had built walls to protect what remained of her heart. Veyron had managed to scale those walls, had found his way past her defenses and made himself a home in her heart. And because of that, because his son had chosen this woman, Lorik knew his own path forward. "Come back with us. You and Veyron both. Let me repay the debt I owe you. Let me give you a home, safety, a place to rest your weapons for a while. Isara's expression shuddered completely. I don't need a home. I don't stay anywhere long enough for it to matter. Everyone needs a home, Lorik said gently. Even warriors. Even those who've convinced themselves they're better off alone. I work better alone. I always have. And yet you bonded with my son. You let him into your heart, into your life. You changed your patterns, your methods, your entire existence to accommodate him. Tell me that isn't what home feels like. Isara looked away, her jaw clenching. Lorik could see the war happening inside her. The battle between what she wanted and what she feared. He understood it. He'd fought similar battles himself after his mate had died, when grief had tried to convince him that loving anything was too dangerous, too painful. Veyron made the decision for them. The cub ran to Isara, pressed against her legs, and looked up at her with pleading eyes. Then he turned and ran back to Lorik, circling between them, his message clear. He wanted them both, needed them both, would not be parted from either. Lorik watched Isara's face as she looked at Veyron, saw the moment her resistance crumbled, the moment love won over fear. She took a shaking breath and nodded once, sharply, as though committing to battle. 1 week. I'll come for 1 week, to make sure he settles back with his pack. After that, I'm gone. Lorik smiled, a small, knowing expression that made her eyes narrow suspiciously. But he didn't argue. He simply extended his hand toward her, an invitation and a promise. 1 week, then. Isara looked at his offered hand for a long moment before taking it. Her grip was strong, her palm calloused from years of wielding weapons, and the touch sent electricity racing up Lorik's arm. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, Lorik saw his future shifting, reforming into patterns he'd never imagined. 1 week, he knew, would not be enough. Not for Veyron, and not, he was beginning to suspect, for him either. The journey to Lorik's territory took 3 days. They traveled through lands that grew progressively more protected, more patrolled, until Isara found herself walking through forests where wolves watched from the shadows, their eyes glowing with recognition of their alpha. Veyron stayed between her and Lorik, sometimes running ahead with youthful enthusiasm, sometimes dropping back to ensure both his chosen people were following. The pack that traveled with them treated Isara with cautious respect. They recognized a warrior when they saw one, could smell the blood and violence that clung to her like perfume. But they also saw the way their young prince followed her, the way he sought her touch and her presence, and that earned her a measure of acceptance she hadn't expected. Lorik walked beside her in silence for most of the journey, his presence a constant weight at her side. Occasionally he would speak, pointing out landmarks or explaining the territory they passed through. His voice was deep and steady, the kind that could command armies or soothe frightened children with equal ease. Isara found herself listening more than she should, found herself curious about him in ways she hadn't been curious about anyone in years. At night, when they made camp, Lorik would handle the pack's business while Isara tended to Veyron. She'd check him over for injuries, though he never had any, and share her food with him, though Lorik's hunters always brought down more than enough for everyone. It was ritual, she realized, a way of maintaining the bond they'd formed, of reassuring both of them that nothing had changed despite their changed circumstances. But things had changed. She could feel it in the way Veyron would curl between her and Lorik at night, creating a bridge between them with his small body. Could see it in the way Lorik's eyes would find her across the campfire, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Could sense it in the way the pack was starting to watch her differently, not as an outsider, but as something else, something more. On the third evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, they crested a final hill, and Isara saw Lorik's kingdom spread before them. It stole her breath. A massive den complex had been carved into the side of a mountain, its entrance flanked by waterfalls that caught the dying light and turned it to liquid fire. Terraces and platforms extended from the mountain's face, connected by bridges made of woven wood and living vines. Wolves moved through the spaces, some in animal form, some in human, creating a living tapestry of motion and purpose. Smoke rose from communal fires, carrying the scent of roasting meat and herbs. Children, both human and wolf, played in cleared spaces while adults watched over them with vigilant care. It was beautiful, more than beautiful. It was alive, thriving, a testament to what could be built when people worked together, when they had something worth protecting. "This is home," Lorik said quietly, watching her face. "This is what you saved when you saved Veyron. He is my heir, the future of all you see before you. Without him, this would have fallen to chaos and war. Rival alphas would have torn it apart fighting for dominance." Isara couldn't find words. She'd saved Veyron because it was the right thing to do, because she couldn't stand by and watch something small and innocent be murdered. She hadn't thought about consequences beyond the immediate, hadn't considered that one act could ripple outward and touch so many lives. "I didn't do it for this," she finally managed. "I didn't do it for reward or recognition." "I know," Lorik said. "That's what makes it matter. That's what makes you remarkable." Their eyes met and held, and Isara felt something shift inside her, some tectonic plate of emotion moving beneath the surface of her carefully maintained control. She looked away first, unable to bear the weight of his gaze, the way he seemed to see through all her armor to the vulnerable flesh beneath. Veyron barked, impatient to be home, and the moment broke. Lorik smiled, a real smile that transformed his fierce features into something almost gentle, and gestured for them to continue down the hill. "Come, let me show you what you've preserved." The pack's welcome was overwhelming. Wolves howled and humans cheered as Lorik walked through the main gates with Veyron at his side. Children ran forward, wanting to touch the returned prince, to assure themselves he was real. Adults pressed close, their relief palpable, their joy transforming the air into something electric and alive. And through it all, Isara walked at Lorik's other side, feeling displaced and out of place, a creature of solitude thrust into the heart of community. She wanted to retreat, to find a quiet corner and disappear, but Lorik kept her close with a hand at her elbow, his touch gentle but firm. "This is Isara Darkfen," he announced, his voice carrying across the assembled pack. "She is the warrior who found my son when he was lost, who protected him when I could not, who defeated 5 assassins to keep him safe. She is a hero of this pack, whether she claims the title or not, and you will treat her with the honor she deserves." The pack erupted in cheers again, and Isara felt her cheeks burning. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to recognition or praise or attention of any kind. She'd spent so long being invisible, being the shadow that passed through without leaving a mark, that being seen felt almost painful. Lorik led her to a dwelling carved into the mountain's face, its entrance hung with woven curtains that swayed in the evening breeze. Inside was a space larger than anywhere she'd lived in years, with a bed covered in furs, a fireplace already crackling with warmth, shelves stocked with supplies, and a window that looked out over the valley below. "This is yours, for as long as you stay. No one will disturb you here without invitation. You're safe, Isara. You can rest." The words hit her harder than any physical blow. Safe. Rest. Concepts so foreign they felt like another language. She turned away from him, not wanting him to see the tears threatening to fall, and heard the soft sound of his footsteps as he moved to the door. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate, but all she had. "No," Lorik said quietly. "Thank you. For everything. For my son's life. For bringing him home. For being exactly who you are in a world that probably tried very hard to make you into something else." Then he was gone, leaving Isara alone in a room that felt too large, too warm, too much like the home she'd never allowed herself to want. Veyron padded into the room a moment later, as though summoned by her need for companionship. He jumped onto the bed and settled himself on the furs, his golden eyes watching her expectantly. Isara joined him, laying down beside the cub who'd changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Outside, the pack's celebrations continued, their voices carrying through the mountain, singing songs of reunion and thanksgiving. And inside, in a room carved from stone and warmed by fire, Isara Darkfen closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something that might have been peace. The week passed in a blur of contradictions. Isara maintained her distance from the pack, keeping to the edges of gatherings, observing but not participating. Yet Veyron drew her in despite her resistance. The young prince insisted on including her in his daily routines, from morning training sessions with young pack members to evening story circles where elders shared tales of wolves and warriors, of love and loss, of battles won and prices paid. And always, there was Lorik. The Alpha King moved through his responsibilities with quiet competence, settling disputes and making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Yet his attention kept returning to her. She would feel his gaze across crowded spaces, would turn to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not desire, though she sensed that simmering beneath the surface. Something deeper. Something that terrified her more than any blade. On the fourth day, she found him alone in a training ground carved into a plateau overlooking the valley. He moved through combat forms with deadly grace, his body a weapon honed by years of warfare and leadership. Sweat gleamed on his skin despite the cool morning air, and his muscles flexed and released with predatory efficiency. Isara watched from the shadows, transfixed despite herself. He knew she was there. She saw the slight shift in his stance, the way his awareness extended to include her presence. But he didn't stop, didn't acknowledge her, simply continued his forms until he'd completed the sequence. Only then did he turn to face her, breathing steady despite the exertion. You move like someone who's fought for their life more times than they can count. So do you, Isara replied, stepping from the shadows. Your reputation doesn't do you justice. Lorik grabbed a cloth and wiped his face, his eyes never leaving hers. What have you heard of me? That you're ruthless with enemies and protective of allies. That you became Alpha King at an age when most wolves are still learning to lead small packs. That your mate died bringing your son into the world and you've ruled alone since, refusing all offers of political marriage or alliance through bonding. All true, Lorik said quietly. My mate, Saria, was my anchor. When she died, part of me died with her. I've spent the years since trying to be the leader my people need while carrying a wound that never quite heals. Isara understood that kind of loss. Not the loss of a mate, but loss nonetheless. She'd buried friends and family, had walked away from places and people she'd cared for, because staying meant watching them change or die. Had learned to keep her heart locked away, because opening it to others only invited pain. Why tell me this? Lorik set down the cloth and walked toward her, each step deliberate and measured. Because you understand. I can see it in your eyes, in the way you hold yourself apart even when Veyron is pulling you closer. You've lost things too, important things. And you've decided it's easier not to connect, not to care, than to risk that kind of pain again. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the salt of his sweat mingled with something wilder, something that called to a part of her she usually kept leashed. But it's not easier, is it? It's just lonelier. And loneliness is its own kind of death, slower but no less final. Isara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was fine alone, that she'd chosen this path and had no regrets. But the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. Because Veyron had shown her what she'd been missing, what she'd sacrificed in the name of self-protection. And because this man, this Alpha King, who ruled hundreds but stood before her with vulnerability in his eyes, was offering her something she didn't know how to accept. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." "I'm not asking you to change," Lorik said softly. "I'm asking you to stay, to let yourself be part of something larger than survival, to let Veyron keep the mother he's chosen, and if you're willing, to let me know you. Not the warrior, not the legend. You, Isara, the woman behind the blade." His hand lifted, hovering near her face, asking permission. Isara's breath caught. She should step back, should reinforce her boundaries, should remind him and herself that she was leaving at the end of the week, that this was temporary, that nothing had changed. But she didn't move, and when his fingers finally touched her cheek, calloused and warm and impossibly gentle, she closed her eyes and let herself feel it, let herself want it, even knowing want was dangerous. "1 week is up in 3 days, she whispered. "Then we have 3 days, Lorik replied. 3 days to figure out if this is something worth fighting for, worth the risk, worth the fear. And if it's not, then you leave with my blessing and my gratitude. And Veyron learns that sometimes love means letting go. But if it is..." Isara opened her eyes and found him watching her with an intensity that made her knees weak. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, a touch so tender it made her ache. "If it is, then we find out what happens when two people who've forgotten how to hope decide to try again. Together." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable. Lorik's lips met hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his warrior's frame, a reverence that spoke of something precious being handled with care. Isara responded without thinking, her hands finding his shoulders, her body leaning into his warmth. The kiss deepened, becoming something hungrier, more desperate, years of loneliness and denial combusting into sudden flame. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lorik rested his forehead against hers and laughed, a sound of wonder and disbelief. "My son," he said, "has excellent taste in mothers." "I haven't agreed to anything," Isara protested weakly. "No," Lorik agreed, his lips quirking into a smile. "But you're considering it. That's more than I hoped for 3 days ago." He was right. She was considering it, considering the impossible, considering staying. The remaining 3 days transformed into something out of time. Lorik carved space in his schedule to show Isara his kingdom, to introduce her to the people who made it function. She met healers who'd spent lifetimes studying the arts of mending bodies and minds, hunters who provided for the pack with skill and honor, teachers who shaped young minds, and warriors who defended borders with unwavering dedication, artisans who created beauty for beauty's sake, reminding everyone that life was more than survival. And everywhere they went, Veyron was there, a small white shadow connecting them, delighted by his father's attention and his chosen mother's presence. The cub was thriving, his confidence growing daily, his personality emerging in ways that filled Isara with unexpected joy. He was curious and brave, gentle with younger cubs, but fierce in play fighting with older ones. He had his father's strength and, she liked to think, a bit of her stubbornness. On the 6th evening, Lorik took her to a hot spring hidden in the mountains above the den complex. Steam rose from crystalline water, creating clouds of warmth in the cool night air. Stars scattered across the sky above them like diamonds spilled on black velvet, and the moon, nearly full again, watched over them with benevolent indifference. They undressed with their backs to each other, a gesture of respect and privacy, and slipped into the water. The heat sank into Isara's muscles, loosening knots she'd carried for years, easing tensions she hadn't realized she held. She sighed, tipping her head back to rest on the smooth stone at the pool's edge, and felt something inside her finally relax. When she opened her eyes, Lorik was watching her from across the pool, his expression unguarded in a way she'd never seen. Not the Alpha King, not the fierce warrior. Just a man, scarred and weary, and achingly human despite the wolf that lived beneath his skin. "Tell me about her," Isara said quietly. "Your mate, Saria." Lorik was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he took a breath and began to speak, his voice carrying across the water like a prayer. "She was light. I know that's a cliché, but it's true. She made everything brighter just by existing. When I met her, I was young and angry, convinced that strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting fear. She taught me that real strength is vulnerability, that admitting you're scared or hurt or overwhelmed doesn't make you less, it makes you human. Real." He paused, his hands trailing through the water, creating ripples that caught moonlight. "We had 5 years together. 5 years of partnership and friendship and love so deep, I thought I'd drown in it. When she told me she was pregnant, I thought my life was complete. I thought nothing could touch us. And then the birth went wrong, and the healers couldn't save her. And suddenly I was standing in a room with my newborn son and my dead mate, and I had no idea how to survive it." Isara's chest tightened with sympathy. She understood that kind of loss, the way it carved you hollow and left you stumbling through life not quite alive. "How did you survive it, I mean?" Lorik looked at her, his eyes reflecting starlight. "Veyron. He needed me, so I couldn't fall apart. I had to keep going, keep leading, keep being the alpha my pack needed, even when all I wanted was to rage at the injustice of a world that would take someone so vital and leave me behind. And eventually, the grief became something I could carry instead of something that carried me. It never went away, but it became bearable." "Do you still love her?" "Every day. But love doesn't have to be exclusive. The heart isn't a finite thing, Isara. It doesn't run out of room. Loving her doesn't mean I can't love again. It just means I know how precious love is. How rare. How worth the risk." Isara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, hot against her cooling skin. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm brave enough." Lorik moved through the water, crossing the distance between them until he was close enough to touch. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. "You killed 5 warriors to save my son. You've survived as a lone warrior in a world designed to break people like you. You've kept your heart soft enough to bond with a wolf cub despite every reason to stay closed off. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Isara. The question isn't whether you're brave enough. It's whether you trust yourself enough to try. What if I hurt him? What if I hurt you? What if I wake up one day and the walls I've built come crashing back down and I push you both away? Then we'll deal with it. Together. That's what family means. Not perfection. Not never struggling. It means facing the hard things together instead of alone." "I don't want to leave," she whispered, the admission tearing out of her like a confession. "I don't want to go back to the way things were, but I'm terrified. Lorik. I'm so terrified of wanting this and losing it." "I know," he said softly. "I've been terrified since the moment I realized I was falling for you. Since I understood that Veyron hadn't just found a protector, he'd found a mother. And I'd found..." He paused, his voice dropping to something barely audible. "Someone who makes me want to hope again. Someone who makes me believe that maybe, just maybe, I get to have this twice in one lifetime." Isara's breath caught. "Falling for you." The words hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and impossibly beautiful. She searched his eyes, looking for doubt or uncertainty, and found only truth. Raw, vulnerable, absolutely terrifying truth. She closed the distance between them and kissed him with everything she had, pouring years of loneliness and fear and desperate longing into the touch. Lorik responded with matching intensity, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her against him until no space remained between them. They broke apart gasping, clinging to each other in the warm water, both shaking with emotion and want, and the overwhelming sense that something fundamental had just shifted in the universe. "Stay," Lorik said against her lips. "Please. Stay with us. With me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice, that taking this risk was worth it." Isara pulled back just enough to see his face, to read the desperate hope there, the fear that matched her own. She thought about Veyron, about the way the cub had looked at her with unconditional trust, thought about the pack, about the way they'd welcomed her despite her strangeness, despite her resistance. Thought about Lorik, about the way he saw through her armor to the woman beneath, about the way he'd lost everything once and was willing to risk it all again. And she thought about herself, about the warrior who'd spent so long alone that she'd forgotten what connection felt like, about the woman who'd saved a wolf cub and found her life transformed, about the future that stretched before her, no longer empty and endless, but full of possibility. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll stay." The joy that transformed Lorik's face was worth every moment of fear. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise and a benediction, and Isara felt something inside her that had been frozen for years finally thaw. When they returned to the den complex, hand in hand, they found Veyron waiting at the entrance to her dwelling. The cub took one look at them, at their joined hands and matching expressions, and his tail began wagging so hard his entire body shook. He howled, high and joyful, and the sound was taken up by wolves throughout the complex until the night rang with celebration. Lorik laughed, scooping his son into his arms, and looked at Isara with such tenderness it stole her breath. "It would seem our son approves. Our son." The word settled into Isara's heart like a key finding its lock. She reached out and ran her fingers through Veyron's soft fur, feeling the cub lean into her touch, and smiled through fresh tears. "Then I guess it's official." "Not quite," Lorik said, his expression turning serious. "There are rituals, ceremonies. The pack will need to formally accept you as their Luna, as my mate and Veyron's mother. It's not simple, Isara. You'll be taking on responsibilities and expectations. You'll be tied to this place, these people. Your freedom will be limited in ways it never has been before." Isara met his gaze steadily. "I spent my whole life free and alone. I think I'd like to try bound and beloved for a while. See how it fits." Lorik's eyes darkened with emotion. "Then tomorrow we begin. Tomorrow, I start the process of making you mine in the eyes of the pack and the world. Tomorrow Isara Darkfen becomes Isara Sunhollow." The name sent a shiver through her. A new identity, a new life, a new purpose. Everything she'd never let herself want, offered freely, without condition. "Tomorrow then," she agreed. "But tonight we just be. The three of us. A family." They spent the night together in her dwelling, the three of them curled on furs before the fire. Veyron slept between them, his small body warm and vital, his breathing deep and peaceful. Lorik held her close, his arms a shield against the world, his presence a promise that she would never be alone again. And Isara, for the first time in longer than she could remember, slept without nightmares, without waking every few hours to check her surroundings, without the constant tension of a warrior who can never fully rest. She slept the way the safe sleep, the way the love sleep, and it was everything. The bonding ceremony took place under the full moon 3 weeks later. Those weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation and integration. Isara trained with the pack's warriors, proving her skills and earning their respect through demonstration rather than reputation. She met with the Council of Elders, answering their questions about her past and her intentions, showing them that while she might be a stranger, she was committed to becoming one of them. Some resisted. Some questioned whether a lone warrior could truly become Luna, whether someone without pack bonds could understand what it meant to lead beside an alpha. But Lorik stood firm, and Veyron's obvious devotion to her won over many doubters. The young prince refused to be separated from her, insisted on her presence at every important event, and made it clear in the way only children can that she was already his mother in every way that mattered. The night of the ceremony, the entire pack gathered in a natural amphitheater carved by ancient rivers, its walls towering stone and its floor smooth rock. Fires burned in a circle around the space, casting dancing shadows and bathing everything in gold and amber light. The moon hung full and massive overhead, so close it seemed you could reach up and touch it. Isara wore white for the first time in her life, a dress made of silk and wolf fur, elegant and wild at once. Her white hair hung loose down her back, woven through with silver threads that caught the firelight. She wore no weapons, had left her blades in her dwelling, a gesture of trust and vulnerability that still felt strange after so many years of never being unarmed. Lorik stood at the center of the amphitheater, dressed in black leather and fur, his long hair braided with beads that clicked softly when he moved. He looked every inch the Alpha King, powerful and commanding. But when his eyes found her across the crowd, she saw only the man who'd wept in her arms, who'd shared his fears and hopes, who'd shown her that strength and vulnerability could coexist. The ceremony was beautiful and terrifying. It involved bloodletting and oath-taking, involved linking her life force to Lorik's and to the Pack's, involved accepting responsibility for hundreds of lives and promising to put their welfare above her own wants. Isara spoke the words clearly, her voice carrying across the amphitheater, meaning every syllable. I, Isara Darkfen, renounce my solitary path and claim Pack, family, and purpose. I bind myself to Lorik Sunhollow, Alpha King, as mate and partner. I claim Veyron Sunhollow as my son, my responsibility, my heart. I accept the mantle of Luna and swear to protect, guide, and serve this pack with everything I am. Lorik's response was equally powerful, his deep voice resonating with authority and emotion. I, Lorik Sunhollow, Alpha King, claim Isara Darkfen as my mate, my Luna, my equal in all things. I give her my trust, my loyalty, my heart. I bind myself to her, as she has bound herself to me, until death separates us, or the world ends, whichever comes first. They cut their palms and pressed them together, their blood mixing and dripping onto the stone beneath their feet. Power surged through Isara, the pack's collective energy flowing into her, accepting her, making her one of them. She gasped at the intensity of it, at the sensation of hundreds of consciousnesses brushing against hers, acknowledging her, welcoming her home. When it was done, when the words were spoken and the blood was spilled and the bonds were forged, Lorik pulled her into his arms and kissed her before the entire pack. The crowd erupted in howls and cheers, celebration exploding through the amphitheater like wildfire. Veyron, who'd watched from a place of honor near the front, transformed. His small cub body shifted and grew, elongating and strengthening, until a young wolf stood in his place, white as snow, golden eyes blazing with joy. It was his first transformation, a sign that the trauma of his separation from his father had finally healed, that he felt safe enough to access his true nature. He bounded forward and launched himself at them, his greater size nearly knocking them both over. Lorik laughed and caught him, and Isara wrapped her arms around them both. The three of them tangled together in a heap of limbs and joy and love. The celebration lasted until dawn. Pack members approached to offer congratulations and gifts, to touch Isara's hand and acknowledge her as their Luna. Food and drink flowed freely, and music filled the air, drums and flutes creating rhythms that spoke of ancient traditions and enduring bonds. Isara danced with Lorik, with Veyron in his human form, with members of the pack who wanted to welcome her properly. As the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Lorik led her away from the celebration to a cliff overlooking the valley. They stood together in silence, watching light chase away darkness, watching their kingdom wake to a new day. "Regrets?" Lorik asked quietly, his arm around her waist, holding her close. Isara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart against her side. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 months ago, alone, and convinced that was how it had to be. Thought about the moment she'd seen 5 warriors surrounding a small white cub and made the choice to intervene. Thought about everything that choice had led to, all the ways her life had changed, all the things she'd gained. "Not one," she said softly. "Not a single one." Lorik's arm tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "Good, because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never do." They stood together as the sun rose fully, bathing them in golden light, warming skin that had been cold for too long. Behind them, they heard Veyron's howl, young and strong and full of happiness, calling them back to the celebration, back to their pack, back to the life they'd chosen together. Isara took Lorik's hand and turned away from the sunrise. They walked back together, Luna and Alpha, equal and bonded, heading toward a future that was uncertain and challenging and absolutely, perfectly right. The first year of their union brought challenges Isara had never anticipated. Being Luna meant more than standing beside Lorik at ceremonies and public events. It meant mediating disputes between pack members, organizing defenses, ensuring the pack's resources were distributed fairly, and making decisions that affected lives in ways both immediate and far-reaching. There were days when the responsibility threatened to overwhelm her, when she missed the simplicity of her old life, where her only concerns were survival and the next contract. On those days, Lorik would find her wherever she'd retreated, would sit beside her in silence until she was ready to talk, would remind her that she didn't have to be perfect, just present. And there was Veyron. The young prince was growing rapidly, his body filling out with muscle and grace, his personality developing in ways that filled her with pride and occasional terror. He was fearless, sometimes recklessly so, and had his father's tendency to lead from the front, to put himself between danger and those he loved. She understood it, recognized it as the same instinct that had driven her into that clearing to face 5 warriors, but understanding didn't make watching him train with full-grown warriors any easier. He called her mother without hesitation now, had never once questioned her place in his life or his heart. He came to her with his triumphs and failures, his questions and fears, treating her with the same trust he gave Lorik. It humbled her, that trust, made her determined to be worthy of it. The pack's initial wariness faded as they saw how she and Lorik worked together, how they balanced each other's strengths and weaknesses. Where Lorik was decisive and commanding, Isara was thoughtful and strategic. Where she was direct and sometimes harsh, he was diplomatic and patient. Together, they created a leadership that was both strong and compassionate, that protected fiercely, but also nurtured. Threats came, as they always did. Rival packs tested their borders, seeing if the Alpha King's new mate had made him soft, had divided his attention and weakened his resolve. They learned quickly that Isara Sunhollow was not a weakness, but a weapon, that she fought with the same lethal skill she'd always possessed, but now with the full weight of the pack behind her. The first time she led a defensive party against border raiders, Lorik had wanted to go instead, had struggled with the Alpha's instinct to protect his mate from danger, but Isara had taken his face in her hands and reminded him that she'd survived alone for years, that being his Luna hadn't made her fragile, hadn't stolen her edge. "I know you want to protect me," she'd said, "but the best way to do that is to trust me. Trust that I can handle myself. Trust that I'll come back to you." He'd let her go, though it had cost him. And when she'd returned victorious, had helped repel the raiders with minimal pack losses, he'd held her so tightly she could barely breathe, and whispered against her hair that he was sorry for doubting, that he'd never make that mistake again. Their relationship deepened with each challenge faced and overcome. They learned each other's bodies and minds, discovered what made the other laugh or cry or rage. They fought, sometimes spectacularly, both too strong-willed to back down easily. But they always found their way back to each other, always chose understanding over pride, connection over being right. Lorik showed her the man beneath the alpha, the one who sometimes woke from nightmares of losing Veyron again, who carried guilt about his mate's death, even though he'd done everything possible to save her. He trusted Isara with his darkness, his weaknesses, and she guarded them fiercely, protected them the way she protected everything precious to her. In turn, she let him see her scars, both physical and emotional. Told him about the family she'd lost to war when she was barely more than a child, about the mentor who'd trained her and then betrayed her trust, about the years of loneliness that had shaped her into someone who believed connection was a liability. He listened without judgment, held her when the memories became too heavy, and slowly, patiently, helped her understand that her past didn't have to define her future. On their first anniversary, Lorik took her back to the hot springs where they'd first confessed their feelings. They lay together in the warm water under the stars, skin to skin, hearts beating in synchrony. "I love you," he said, the words still holding the power to make her breath catch. "I love who you were, who you are, who you're becoming. I love your strength and your vulnerability, your fierceness and your gentleness. I love that you chose this, chose us, when you could have chosen anything." Isara traced the line of his jaw, feeling the rasp of his beard against her palm. "A year ago, I thought I knew what my life would be. Alone, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. And then a wolf cub looked at me with gold eyes and chose me, and his father looked at me with eyes that held the same gold and chose me too. And suddenly everything changed." She paused, gathering her thoughts, trying to find words for emotions that felt too large for language. "You terrified me. This terrified me. The idea of loving someone, of being responsible for someone's happiness, of letting myself want something this much. It went against everything I'd taught myself. But I'm glad I was terrified. I'm glad I did it anyway. Because this, us, our family, it's the bravest thing I've ever done, and the best." Lorik kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise, and they made love under the stars, their bodies speaking what words couldn't, celebrating the choice they'd made and continued making every day. When they returned to the den complex the next morning, they found Veyron waiting with news. He'd been accepted into the elite warrior training program, had proven himself skilled and dedicated enough to train alongside the pack's best fighters. The pride on his young face made Isara's chest tight with emotion. She pulled him into a hug. This boy who'd been a small cub not so long ago, who'd chosen her as his mother, when she'd had no idea what that meant, or how to do it. He hugged her back, his strength surprising her, and whispered thank you against her shoulder. "For what?" she asked. "For staying. For choosing me. For being exactly what I needed even when you didn't think you knew how." Tears pricked her eyes, the good kind, the kind that came from happiness too large to contain. "Oh, my heart. You chose me first. You saved me as much as I saved you." Lorik joined their embrace, wrapping his arms around them both, and they stood together in the morning light, a family forged by chance and choice and courage. Their pack moved around them, going about their daily routines, secure in the knowledge that their Alpha and Luna and Heir were united, unshakable, whole. Years passed, measured in seasons and celebrations, in challenges overcome and joys shared. Veyron grew into a warrior whose skill and honor made both his parents proud, whose leadership abilities marked him as truly his father's son. He found his own mate eventually, a fierce young woman from a neighboring pack who matched him in strength and spirit, and gave Isara and Lorik grandchildren who filled their lives with new purpose and delight. Isara never stopped being a warrior. She trained the pack's fighters, led defensive missions when needed, and maintained the skills that had defined her for so long. But now those skills served a purpose beyond survival. They protected something precious. They defended home. She and Lorik grew old together, their bodies acquiring the scars and stiffness that came with years of battle and leadership. But their bond only deepened. They knew each other so completely that words often became unnecessary, a glance or touch conveying everything that needed to be said. They ruled together until age and wisdom told them it was time to step aside, to let Veyron take the mantle of Alpha King and lead the pack into its next chapter. On the night of Veyron's coronation, after the ceremonies and celebrations had ended, Isara and Lorik walked to the cliff where they'd stood on the morning after their bonding. The view hadn't changed. The valley still spread before them, their pack's home safe and thriving. But everything else had changed. Everything. "Do you ever miss it?" Lorik asked, his hair now more silver than black, his body still strong but marked by time. "The freedom of your old life?" Isara leaned against him, her own white hair now streaked with gray, her hands bearing scars from decades of fighting and living. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of answering only to myself, of having no one to worry about but me. But then I remember what I have now, what I gained when I stopped running, and the missing becomes nothing compared to the gratitude." She turned to face him, cupped his weathered face in her hands, saw her whole life reflected in his golden brown eyes. "I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. Would save that wolf cub again and again, knowing it would lead me here. To you, to Veyron, to this family, this pack, this life. You were right all those years ago. The heart isn't finite. It doesn't run out of room. Mine has expanded to hold more love than I ever imagined possible." Lorik kissed her forehead, a gesture so familiar and cherished it still made her heart flutter. "Mine too," he whispered. "Mine too." They stood together as night deepened around them, as stars emerged to keep watch, as the moon rose to light their way. Behind them, their pack slept secure. Before them, the future unfurled in mystery. And between them, love endured, strong and sure and eternal. Isara Darkfin, who had once believed herself meant for solitude, had found her place. Not by seeking it, but by opening her heart to a small white cub who needed saving. And in saving him, she'd saved herself. Had found the home she'd never known she needed. Had discovered that the greatest strength wasn't in standing alone, but in choosing to stand together. The warrior had found her peace. The wanderer had found her home. And the woman who'd thought herself incapable of love had learned that hearts, like wolves, were meant to run in packs. That belonging wasn't a weakness, but a triumph. That choosing to stay was the bravest thing of all. As the moon climbed higher and the night grew deep, Lorik took her hand, and they walked back toward the den complex, toward the life they'd built together, toward the family that had formed around a single moment of courage in an ash forest clearing. And with each step, Isara felt the same certainty she'd felt that first night, when Veyron had pressed his nose to her palm and chosen her. This was right. This was home. This was love. And it was everything. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.